All right, I think probably the majority of people who are joining have joined in by now. So before we get into Lindsay and Kylie presenting, um, I just finished a ARI Level 1 Avalanche course out in Estes Park, well, based out of Estes Park. I was actually in Rocky Mountain National Park, and lucky enough to have the guide for my course joining us tonight. Jaffe has joined us, and could you please introduce yourself, Jaffe? And I think the students would love to hear about what you do.
Thank you, Justin. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me join. Yeah, my name is Jaffe. I'm a full-time mountain guide. I've been guiding full-time for about 12, 13 years now. Work in the discipline, and I've worked as a ski patroller, as a guide, as an avalanche instructor. So wear many hats, but almost all of it in the field. And it's always really enjoyable to see folks who help me further the craft. And so I'm psyched to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, well, Lindsay, if you're ready, I think you should be able to share your screen if you need to, and then get us started with the WMS guidelines.
All right, thanks so much. Just kind of pull up
Or your intro, sorry.
portion of the screen. Okay, can folks kind of be focused there on my slides? Is that working out okay? Done this a couple times.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, great. All right, so my name is Lindsay Fowle. I'm a third-year medical student at Oregon Health and Science University. Before medical school, I directed an avalanche department at a ski area in the Teton Mountains in Wyoming. And we'll be talking about avalanche and snow burial per WMS guidelines this evening. So I'll be presenting the fantastic guidelines that are published by the Wilderness Medical Society on the prevention and management of avalanche and non-avalanche snow burial accidents. We'll also run through a rapid whirlwind tour of some avalanche basics. And then the guidelines, I just kind of designed it so we'll mention the guidelines with each relevant topic as we go through. So we'll talk about basics, the complications of burial, avalanche prevention, rescue, resuscitation, and then non-avalanche snow burial. These guidelines were published in 2017 by an expert panel. Many of these individuals are just wonderful leaders in the field, really designed by an excellent panel. So I want to give praise to that before we start. As with other WMS guidelines, the recommendations are graded in accordance with the scale from the American College of Chest Physicians. And each recommendation is graded from 1A down to ungraded, with 1 being the strongest recommendation. And then A consisting of the highest quality evidence. So it'll go from 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, 2B, 2C, and down. There are 41 total recommendations. 10 are aimed at prevention, 12 on rescue, 17 for resuscitation, and 2 with regards to non-avalanche snow burial. And I just made a little chart here so you can see from 1A to ungraded, just the quality of this evidence. I want to start out with the fundamental question of what an avalanche is. I just kind of like going back to dictionary. I was an English major years ago, and the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines an avalanche as a large mass of snow, ice, earth, rock, or other material in swift motion down a mountainside. Here's a basic schematic, just so we're all on the same page. If you look at this little diagram here, a crown is what we call like the area where the avalanche starts from. The flanks are the sides. The bed surface is what the avalanche slides on. And then the deposition zone, or the debris, is where all the snow ends up. So, as you can imagine, if someone was going to be caught and then buried in an avalanche, they wouldn't end up in this bed surface, but they would end up down here in the debris or deposition zone. Here's a real life picture. And then just keeping in mind that with time, some of these areas will be harder to delineate. So the crown and the flanks might actually just start to blend in with the rest. And here's kind of a recipe for an avalanche. So what it takes to cause an avalanche. Thinking of it as a trifecta between terrain, weather, and snowpack. And before an avalanche, the balance is often like a castle built on sand, and then it's the trigger what tips the scale. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. So certain terrain factors to consider are first a slope angle. It's often said steep enough to slide or flat enough, but flat enough to hold snow. And 35 to 45 degrees is the most common angle for avalanches to occur. Convexities are often where avalanches are triggered. If you can see here, there can be increased tension on this convex area of the slope. And you can think of it as a rubber band, kind of where that slab is getting stretched the most. Underlying rock bands can provide passive solar radiation, which can warm and weaken the snow bonds. And then cornices, here's a little picture, a diagram of what one looks like, are overhanging snow that can collapse, then cause further stress on the snowpack. And they're formed from wind, so snow will be blown from one side of the slope to the other and create this overhanging. Here's a dramatic picture of a cornice, but you get the idea there. And another terrain feature to consider with avalanches with regards to what we call terrain traps. So where the consequences of an avalanche are worse than normal. So in this picture here, there's a gully, and whereas snow would normally slide down the hill, this gully has caused the snow to pile up deeper and cause a deeper burial than what would be normal. Something like a cliff can also be considered a terrain trap, because if someone was caught even in a small slide but knocked off the cliff, the consequences of being involved would be greater than normal. And here's a little picture from the backside of the ski area I used to work at, where there's a lot of these terrain features we're talking about. There's convexities, there's cornices, there's underlying rock bands, and then there's the terrain trap of cliffs. And indeed, actually here, someone had walked out onto the cornice, which collapsed, caused an avalanche. The person was brought down through the slope, off the cliff, and then down onto this slope below. And then with regards to another part of our recipe is the snowpack. So we like to, if we want to simplify it, we'll think about it in three things. There's a slab, which is what's going to be the avalanche. There's the weak layer, and then there's the bed surface, so what the avalanche slides on. Ideally, heavier snows on the bottom, lighter snows on top, but unfortunately, that's often not the way it works when avalanches happen. And here's just kind of a couple shots showing how we can get a picture of what the snowpack's doing. So we'll dig a pit in the snow. We'll look at layers and we'll assess the types of snow grains and the different densities of the layers of snow. And then we'll perform what are called stability tests that can mimic different triggers to the snow, so we can see how sensitive a snowpack is to certain stresses. And then considering the last ingredient, which would be weather. So when we think about precipitation, is it coming down as dry or wet snow? Is it coming down really fast and not allowing a snowpack to adjust to its new load? And how much total snow falls within a certain weather event? And then wind is actually interesting. It's said that wind can load a slope 10 times faster than the heaviest precipitation rate. So how fast is that wind blowing, and what direction is it coming from, which will determine where it puts the snow. So which slopes, which aspect of slopes will be unstable. And then also, was the wind blowing at a really high amount for 1 hour or for 12, which can also determine how much snow is placed on that slope. And then with regards to temperature, the idea that rapid warming can cause water in the snow, which can then percolate down through the snowpack and essentially cause like a layer of lubrication for that slab to slide on. So rapid warming, strong sun can also cause avalanche conditions. So just kind of here's an example of maybe a backcountry ski tour where you're skiing around, you're looking at different terrain. What's the weather doing? Is it really sunny, or is a storm coming in? And then maybe throughout the day, you're also taking a look at what's going on in that snowpack. In the professional forecasting world, there are a lot of different categories of avalanches. Storm slabs, wind slabs, we talked about cornices. But for our understanding today, I'll just break things down into loose, slab, or wet avalanches. A loose avalanche is the release of unconsolidated snow, and it's layers of soft snow near the snow surface. These are typically smaller, But just thinking about terrain traps, they can also carry with them significant consequences if you're over a cliff or something else. Dry slab or just a slab avalanche is what you typically comes to mind when you think of avalanche. And it's the release of a cohesive layer of snow. And it happens when the bonds of the slab to an underlying weak layer in the snow break. Wet slides are caused when the flow of liquid water weakens the bond between the slab and the surface below. They often occur during prolonged warming events or rain on snow events, and they can be unpredictable and very destructive due to their large size, as you can see from some of these. All right. Now we'll move on to the complications of avalanche burial, basically talking about why it's bad. And thinking about three main things: asphyxia, trauma, and hypothermia. Asphyxia is the most common mechanism of death. It's attributed to about 75% of avalanche deaths. The time to extrication is considered the foremost determinant of survival. A Swiss study determined that excluding trauma, one has a greater than 90% survival rate if extracted within 15 minutes, but only a 30% survival rate after 30 minutes. And asphyxia can occur by three different mechanisms. It can be physical blockage of the upper airway from inhaled snow. It can be from ice mask formation, which we'll describe in a second, or it can be from oxygen deprivation from breathing expired air. When we think about oxygen deprivation, often you're buried in snow that consolidates and hardens, so you're just in a very confined space. And inspired air normally carries 21% oxygen, 0.03% CO2, whereas expired air contains 16% oxygen and 5% CO2. So basically, to survive longer than 30 minutes, you need a patent airway and an air pocket. And a larger air pocket provides an increased survival chance. And it's also, the type of snow can also play a factor into how well that air percolates through. If it's denser, wetter, kind of warmer spring snow, it will further prevent air from coming through to your little pocket. And then it's also important to consider in full burials just the weight of the snow on the chest. So you can think of settled snow from an avalanche like moist concrete, which can prevent your chest from expanding fully and thereby impair optimal ventilation. And then also the idea of ice mask formation. And this occurs when someone has a patent airway and they're exhaling water vapor when they breathe, and that will condense and freeze in front of the face, which will prevent proper airflow. Moving on to trauma, trauma accounts for a little less than 25% of fatalities between North America and European statistics. It is more prevalent in North America than Europe, and this is just due to because the fact that we often have more trees which, in our avalanche terrain, which can cause more trauma. And then head, C-spine, trunk, and extremity injuries are common. And also important is that traumatic brain injuries can lead to an altered level of consciousness, which can further accelerate asphyxiation. Fewer deaths are actually attributed to hypothermia than you might think. And this is just due to the fact because hypothermia requires a patent airway and time in the cold. So it's more likely that someone might asphyxiate or die from trauma before hypothermia sets in. But it can also complicate other mechanisms of asphyxia or trauma. Common, which I find really interesting, are coagulopathies because the platelets are sequestered into the portal circulation of the liver. So you'll have a low platelet level, and thrombin and fibrin can also be inhibited. And then also with low body temperatures comes cardiac arrhythmias. And so patients who are very hypothermic are also very sensitive to any kind of jostling or movements. This is important to consider in a hypothermic patient. At this most recent winter wilderness WMS conference, there's this great revised Swiss system on hypothermia from Dr. Martin Musi. And basically, it looks like we're going to be moving towards the direction of like our hypothermia scales. Instead of using core temperature, we'll estimate the risk of cardiac arrest via the AVPU scale. But just like via the old standards here, we talk about hypothermia beginning when a core temp is less than 35, and you have your maximum shivering, your increased metabolic rate. And then as the temperature starts to drop, so does your level of consciousness. Shivering ceases. When you're in the moderate range here, the thing I always find very interesting is the paradoxical undressing that occurs. And when people have been asked why they've taken their clothes off with hypothermia, they've stated just because they felt very, very warm. And then as you get colder and colder, you increase your risk of ventricular fibrillation. And core temp is the most accurate measurement, but very hard to get in the field. So that's why we're thinking about moving to the AVPU scale. And then just with regards to after drop, this is the cooling that can occur after extrication. Basically, if your extremities have a lot of cool blood in them and they flow back to your heart, it'll cool your core temperature down, which is also worth considering. So just because you've pulled someone out and they look okay, they can continue to cool down after that. So with regards to avalanche prevention, education and public safety and avalanche avoidance are the main veins here. And there are many different educational organizations in the US and throughout the world. They teach anything from snow science, safe snow travel, and rescue techniques.
It's connecting me.
And then just the idea that with public safety, it's not only recreationalists, but also travelers and inhabitants in mountainous areas can become in avalanches.
Bigger.
So, avalanche mitigation is performed for roads, for ski areas, and then there's daily advisories that the Forest Service sends out in the US to help inform recreationalists of the avalanche risk for the day.
Yeah, I hear you.
Here's just an example of what an avalanche forecast might look like. And so danger scale in North America is based on likelihood versus consequence of the avalanches. So how likely are they to happen that day? And then if they were to happen, how big and how destructive would they be?
Is it gonna rain?
Here's an example from the Northwest Avalanche Center of just different zones and the different risks for the day and what it'll look like. All right, so just getting into the WMS recommendations on avalanche avoidance. Basically touting education experience as the cornerstone of risk mitigation. And then different techniques to avoid avalanches can include, which they describe in the article, is avoiding slopes greater than 30 degrees, traveling on ridges, traveling in thick forested terrain, and then avoiding avalanche terrain during high risk conditions when avalanches are more likely. So like we discussed, like immediately after or during heavy snowfall, wind, or warming. And then they also recommend that familiarity and regular practice with safety equipment are vital to avalanche avoidance. So if avoiding an avalanche has failed and you trigger an avalanche, the main principles consist of getting off the slab, avoiding burial, minimizing trauma, and avoiding asphyxia. So here's some recommendations from the Wilderness Medical Society about what to do in order to avoid getting caught and buried. So they say to consider using a slope cutting and a belay. And basically, like considering a belay rope, the idea is that you have this rope that's anchored outside of the potential path that someone could be tied to test a slope. And that would allow you to be caught and not involve the avalanche if it did happen. You can cross slopes one at a time. So safer travel. This will minimize the involvement of your party and it can leave witnesses and rescuers in case someone's caught. And then also the idea of moving between what we call islands of safety. So areas where you think the avalanche is less likely to occur. And they do mention here slope cutting, also known as ski cutting. So basically where you can trigger avalanches in a controlled fashion. This can eliminate or mitigate like the amount of snow that's left to slide. But it does require experience and training, and it's definitely not for people who haven't had much experience in snow travel. And then it's always important to plan an escape route. So this can increase the likelihood of a successful outcome. And the idea is that you can hopefully move towards your escape with enough speed to hopefully outrun the avalanche. And then they say if you are caught in an avalanche, you should attempt to escape by trying to get off the slab or trying to avoid burial by maybe anchoring into that bed surface, that the avalanche was sliding on, with maybe a ski pole or an ice axe. If possible, trying to grab a tree. And then there's not a lot of data to support this, but physics do support the idea of trying to swim to stay on top of the snow before it loses its speed and hardens. And then they also say that you should try to remove your ski and snowboard equipment if you are caught in avalanche. The idea is that you're less likely to sink and that you would be easier to extricate if you had less things attached to you. But they do say to consider leaving your backpack on, as it may protect your spine. And then with regard to airbags, these are backpacks or vests that contain 1 to 2 inflatable balloons, and then you manually deploy them by pulling a handle when you're caught. And they fill up via compressed air or a battery-powered fan. And some models surround the head and neck when deployed, and here's a little picture of one. They recommend consider using them when you enter avalanche terrain. They're the only avalanche safety devices that are aimed at preventing burial. And it's based on a theory, which I kind of like this little fact, but it's based on a theory called granular convection. Basically, like we have this flow of various sized particles, the larger ones will rise to the surface. So this airbag, if you have it, will help you to rise to the surface. And its use is supported in both simulations and epidemiologic studies. They've used crash test dummies for tests, and then also statistics from North America and Europe. They show that mortality was reduced from 22 to 11%. There is, however, a non-inflation rate that you should be aware of, usually from operator error. So just regular practice with this, if you're going to use it, is essential. And then with regards to preventing trauma if involved in an avalanche, the Wilderness Medical Society recommends considering the use of helmets when traveling in avalanche terrain. And there was a Utah study a few years back that showed that TBIs may contribute to death by asphyxia. That there are a few downsides to helmets, but at the time of these guidelines, there were no studies existing that regarded their effectiveness in reducing death to head trauma. And some do speculate that the velocities of medium to large avalanches may exceed helmet capabilities. But most avalanche fatalities are actually in small to medium sized avalanches. And helmets could furthermore help prevent TBIs, lacerations, and the onset of hypothermia. And then airbag backpacks, they also say may help prevent trauma just due to the fact that it's this large mass protecting your head and neck. And there's a theoretical benefit, but no data exists as of this publication. And as far as avoiding asphyxia, the WMS recommends using physical maneuvers, such as taking the crook of your elbow and putting it in front of your face, the idea that could prevent facial trauma and also provide a small air pocket. It could also prevent snow from going down your trachea. And then they also recommend considering the use of what's called an artificial air pocket device. And these are usually attached to backpacks where you have a tube that when you enter avalanche terrain, you stick in your mouth, and then it diverts the CO2 via one-way valve to your back so that you're less likely to inhale the CO2 and that you'll be able to make better use of the oxygen around you. And there was a randomized crossover controlled trial a few years back. It showed breathing with an artificial air pocket device sustained adequate oxygenation for up to 60 minutes. Also with this, studies have shown that it is difficult to, if you don't already have the tube in your mouth when you're entering avalanche terrain, that it can be difficult, similar to deploying an airbag, to use correctly when
Yes, please.
All right, so avalanche rescue can be accomplished through self-rescue, small group rescue, or professional rescue. We'll discuss the basics of small group and professional rescue, along with the guidelines here. So the goals of avalanche rescue are to locate the victims, perform any medical treatment that's necessary, evacuation, and then just considering the logistics of a prolonged operation support, because getting someone out of the backcountry can be quite involved. So here's a basic rescue schematic, and WMS states that a systematic approach can maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of the rescuers. The sequence can be adaptable to the number of victims and the rescue personnel. And like in a small group, one person may have multiple roles. And then as with other triage situations, some steps can happen simultaneously. It's important to notify EMS to get additional resources headed your way, but don't let this delay your initial response because groups will take a while to get there. And as we talked about, time is important for survival from asphyxiation. So when an avalanche does occur, it's important to establish leadership immediately. And that leadership can assess risks, make a plan, manage resources, and help to adapt to conditions. And then it's important to assess scene safety, to constantly reassess throughout a rescue. And ideally, one person could be dedicated to this task, you know, someone with a good vantage point who could see the entire scene and remain hands off. But in a smaller group, that would be a luxury. And then with regards to the surface search, this can be simultaneous with a transceiver search, which we'll get into. And basically, you're going to be looking for visible clues, and you'll begin at your last scene point. And then there's what's called a pinpoint or probe search, which will move to shoveling to excavate the buried victim. And we'll discuss these in a little bit. And then you would deal with any medical care and evacuate. So just here's the rescue sequence per recommendations, as we talked about. So leadership, scene safety, surface search, transceiver, probe, shovel, and then medical and emergency services. And I put this photo in here just to kind of create a feeling of what it might feel like to ski into or to enter an avalanche scene when you know that someone might be involved. And it's not going to feel comfortable, and it's important that you really just keep that sequence in mind and stay systematic. So we mentioned just briefly the transceiver, what's also known as a beacon search, a pinpoint or probe search, and shoveling. These are 3 steps that are different from other wilderness medicine incidents, so we'll just review them a little bit more here. So here's a little basic schematic of what it is, like what a transceiver search consists of. And most recreational skiers or snowboarders and often climbers or snowshoers might have what's called a beacon, or a snowmobiler too. I won't leave them out. And they travel with a beacon, which is on its own radio signal, different from cell phones and other radios. And it's in transmit mode. And then it can switch to search mode when somebody needs to find a buried person whose beacon is in transmit mode. And ideally, it consists of 3 stages, what's called the signal search, where you're getting the signal because you won't necessarily be in range in the beginning. And then it will draw you in on the core search, and then you use a fine grid-like search to really lower your signal to the lowest possible distance. And so just regarding the recommendations from the WMS and transceivers, they do stress that everyone should carry them in avalanche terrain and know how to use them, and they should practice these skills. They can interfere with metals and electronics. So if you're in transmit, you want to keep it 20 centimeters away from like a smartphone, a pacemaker, an insulin pump. And then when you're in search mode, you actually want to keep it a minimum of 50 centimeters away. And then other electronic devices like cell phones and GPS are actually ineffective because the signal is not as precise as an avalanche beacon, which seems wild in this day and age, but that's actually still where we're at. So avalanche transceivers are the preferred search tool. And then when you get that minimal reading on your avalanche transceiver, you're going to move to what's called probing, or the pinpoint search. And you're going to complete probing in a systematic fashion. You're going to feel for these inconsistencies in the snow. So you're going to monitor the depth, and you're going to leave in place if you think you've actually struck your avalanche partner or victim. And humans will feel different from rocks, ground, avalanche, snow debris. And when a possible strike occurs, you leave the probe in place, and that'll serve as a target for when you're shoveling. And then when you're probing, the technique is to probe perpendicular to the snow in concentric circles, and each hole that you probe, you're going to start in the center from your lowest signal and keep moving out, is going to be 25 centimeters away from the last hole in concentric circles. And then here's the WMS recommendations. And they recommend a 3-meter collapsible probe. The idea, they do make 2-meter ones, but the idea is that most snowpacks are very deep, especially when you have avalanche debris. That you do probe in a concentric circular pattern with holes spaced 25 centimeters apart. And then once you've had that positive probe strike and you think you have the victim below, you'll start to shovel. And this is a very necessary skill, and surprisingly, it's actually, I would say, the longest, the most time-intensive section of extrication. Just picture shoveling through essentially concrete. And so because avalanche debris does harden so much, a metal shovel blade is the most durable and recommended tool. Studies have shown that composite materials will break in avalanche debris. And the recommendations are to begin downhill from the probe strike, 1.5 times the burial depth. But I think if you want to keep it simple, just know to start below where your probe strike is. The idea is that you're digging into the patient, not on top of them, and further making it more difficult for them to breathe. And they recommend a paddling technique, which plows the snow downhill. You'll need to be efficient and quick. And paddling technique, they found, removes the most amount of snow the quickest. And then if you have multiple people, they recommend employing what's called a conveyor belt method, which essentially just allows the snow to be moved downhill in rapid succession. That you rotate your positions, because the ones up front here will be more labor intensive than the ones in the back, so you can avoid fatigue. And here's the recommendations stating a metal shovel. You're going to shovel like a paddle, and you're going to use a conveyor belt method. And then just taking a look at professional rescue organizations. It can include mountain guides, volunteers, ski patrols. They differ from partner rescue because response time is longer, but they do have increased resources. And it is important to keep in mind that response time is typically longer than 30 minutes, which is that asphyxiation timeline where we found less than 30% survival. So live recoveries are less common by the time an organized group becomes involved, but they can offer what's called a probe line, which we'll discuss, RECO, transport options such as helicopters and snowmobiles, and then everybody's favorite, the Avalanche dog here. So the recommendations do include the use of what's called an incident command system, which is a standardized approach to command, control, and coordination of an emergency response. And it provides this common hierarchy so that responders from multiple agencies or groups can be effective in working together. And the ICS was initially developed to address problems of interagency responses to wildfires in Arizona and California. But now it's used in all kind of hazard situations, from active shootings to hazmats and avalanches as well. And therefore, the WMS recommends its use. Here's an example of what an avalanche ICS structure can look like. And this would be for a very large scale one. And it can even be simplified to just incident commander with, like a search group and maybe like a medical group. And then as you start to involve more things, you can add different teams. But the idea is that everyone can better focus on their sole task and do that task better than multitasking. And then with regards to scene management, Wilderness Medical Society recommends that boundary control and scene marking is employed. The idea is that you can keep that kind of what's similar to maybe like a crime scene preserved, so that you can continue to evaluate, the most likely places that someone could be buried. And then with regards to a probe line, as that photo showed, a bunch of people with probes all in a line. So this is usually initiated after an initial transceiver search has been performed, and you haven't found anyone, or you're not sure, or in searches where victims have been buried without transceivers, like some of the large scale avalanches that happen in a town in Italy or at a ski area in Europe. And it's important in these things to maximize efficiency to increase your chance of uncovering a live victim. And probe lines usually have a leader who's directing the whole line. And the idea is that you have 3 holes per step. You go left, center, right, and you space them out within a 50 by 50 centimeter grid. And they recommend you probe 1.5 meters deep using this 3-hole per step method. The idea is that, at least from statistics in the US, 88% of burials are within that 1.5 meters. So it should allow you to get to most people within the most efficient time, kind of a utilitarian approach there. And then with regards to this RECO, so RECO is actually based off this harmonic radar, and Searcher uses what's this yellow thing here. This is the RECO detector, which identifies RECO reflector diodes. And these things are embedded in many ski clothes. If you look at some of your ski clothes, you'll see like RECO, and you might feel something slightly rigid about this big. They're small and light, and they don't require a power source. And so this detector is large, and it is harder to use than a transceiver. I would say it requires frequent practice for like proficiency. And its signal can be affected by water content. So wet snow, its signal is significantly decreased. But it is, it does have its use, because like these things can easily be embedded in people's clothes. And so it's better than nothing if that's what you got. And RECO can also be used from helicopters, because air does not provide much like impedance to the signal. So it's also useful if you want to search an area and you can't put rescuers in the field for whatever reason, due to avalanche hazard, weather, etc. All right, and now moving to the avalanche dogs. So avalanche dogs are trained to detect buried victims by scent. One study found that survival is no better than detection of victims from probe lines. And some of the downsides are transport time, sometimes getting a dog to certain places, canine distraction from contaminated debris fields, like when a searcher leaves a ham sandwich on the field, and then just the time it takes to train a dog. But however, in practice, dogs can often find buried articles or people as quick or quicker than transceiver searchers. And they are also good for searches that have been going on that have found no signals from transceivers or probe lines. Dogs will often pick up scent eventually. All right, and then talking about helicopters. So helicopters can decrease response time to remote locations. They also can reduce rescuer exposure time. They can assist in evacuating patients and rescuers more quickly once the search is complete. And then, like we said, they can also help with recos. They also do carry significant risk. There are many helicopter accidents described in literature. So it's important before you deploy a helicopter, and the WMS specifies here that they should employ a risk assessment before helicopter use and have strict safety guidelines. So in summary, with professional rescue organizations, they do carry many benefits. They take time to arrive, as this party here likely would as well. So partner rescue is your best chance for survival. All right, and moving on to avalanche resuscitation. Just keeping in mind that this will be a challenging aspect of the job, and it does include an austere environment with limited equipment and personnel. So other things are just thinking about the fact that you're probably not going to have all the ideal resources available. And data is important. So when you come across an avalanche scene, it's just really important. You're the first piece in this link to the chain of survival. And others will be deciding on appropriate action based off of this initial report. So just really taking into account the details. And having, realistic expectations that when someone is involved in an avalanche burial, like the prognosis is not always great. And it will require hard work. You're likely in it for the long haul, and it will probably be emotionally difficult. Resuscitation can begin when the head and chest are first exposed before the body is completely extricated. Airway patency, presence of an air pocket, and extrication vital signs will guide the treatment and transport decisions. And once extricated, consider calling in any available resources as soon as you can, because you probably will need help getting this person out. And here's just the way I like to think of it and break it down. So was someone involved in an accident, in avalanche? Were they fully buried? If not, I'm still worried. Are they injured? Are they hypothermic? And then if they were fully buried, did they have that adequate air pocket and airway? Those are all just kind of initial things to be considering. So if someone is involved if they're fully buried but not injured, the WMS does recommend that they still be transported to the nearest medical facility. The idea is that if they're alert and oriented after a full burial, cold stress and mild hypothermia are still possible. For example, pulmonary edema is a rare, but it's a possible later development just due to the negative pressure and then also the hypoxia-induced left heart failure. So for this reason, just know that you'll probably be sending that fully buried person to the hospital regardless of their apparent condition. And then keeping in mind that trauma can exacerbate hypothermia and asphyxiation. So just be treating trauma in accordance with whatever generally accepted practice to the area, whether it's like Nexus, Canadian C-spine, but keep in mind those local protocols. And then talking about hypothermia, we're really considering this basically only if there's been a long burial with a patent airway, because otherwise trauma and asphyxiation, like we talked about, are going to reign. Suspect moderate to severe hypothermia in a cold, unconscious patient. And these patients do need to go to an ECLS facility if possible, just given their potential complications of cardiac arrhythmias, coagulopathies, and not forgetting about afterdrop like we talked about. And so the recommendations do state that we should treat hypothermia according to the WMS practice guidelines or to the European Resuscitation Council guidelines. So if someone has been buried in an avalanche and they are experiencing cardiac arrest, the prognosis is just overall poor. This is kind of dark, but there's one paper when I was reading about just automatic compressions, chest compressions. They were studying Lucas devices for avalanche cardiac arrest. And they just ended up talking about how Lucas was really helpful for organ donation. That they really just didn't have good good outcomes otherwise, which was kind of a sad but true fact at this point. So the best case scenario, if someone has cardiac arrest from avalanche burials, is when bystanders CPR is initiated immediately, and when return of spontaneous circulation is achieved at the site. But the treatment of cardiac arrest basically consists of a quick initiation, defibrillation, advanced life support, mechanical chest compressions, which you could consider if you have the capability. We'll talk about intermittent or delayed CPR, and then withholding and terminating resuscitation efforts. So we'll go through the guidelines for these. So as far as initiating resuscitation goes, assess everyone for their ABCs, and then commence CPR and ALS unless an indication for withholding exists. And just the key principle here is that cardiac arrest with a burial time less than 60 minutes and a core temp greater than 30 degrees Celsius, that's likely due to trauma or asphyxia, not hypothermia, like we talked about. And that cardiac arrest due to asphyxia or trauma carries a far worse prognosis than cardiac arrest due to hypothermia. So that's kind of how these guidelines go. Basically, if someone is more likely in cardiac arrest due to hypothermia, you're going to want to continue with resuscitation, keep trying until you can rewarm them. If you think that their cardiac arrest is from asphyxiation or trauma, then you're going to give it those 30 minutes of resuscitation efforts, and then it's okay to terminate. That's kind of the pattern that we're going to be going through here. As far as defibrillation goes, if you get a shockable rhythm, then you can defibrillate according to local protocols. But it is worth considering that defibrillation is less effective if someone is really cold. And if they're really cold, the risk of going back into, cardiac arrest is higher. So it is possible to consider delaying defibrillation attempts until the patient has been properly rewarmed. It depends on the guidelines, whether you're looking at the Wilderness Medical Society, American Heart Association, or European guidelines. But they vary from 1 to 3 defibrillation attempts. The idea being that multiple defibrillation attempts will damage the heart muscle. So use your defibrillation attempts wisely. And then with regards to ALS, the Wilderness Medical Society suggests considering ventilating to normal capnia or resuscitating with warmed isotonic fluids that can help support circulation. So these are options to consider. And then mechanical chest compressions, they say if they're available, definitely use them, especially for those difficult long transports. As you can imagine, it'd be pretty difficult to be evacuating someone in the field in a toboggan and performing chest compressions. But if you could have like a Lucas device going at the same time, it would make extrication a lot easier, and then the compressions would be a lot more effective. And then with regards to delayed intermittent CPR, and sometimes with rescue, you can't just be performing CPR all the time. If you think about loading in a helicopter, transporting in a toboggan or a sled, it might be hard. So especially like the lower the core temperature that someone has, the more you can increase that, that window of delayed or intermittent CPR. So they say that if someone's core temp is less than 28, you can go 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off. And then if someone's core temp is actually less than 20, you can actually delay up to 10 minutes between CPR intervals. And then with regards to withholding or terminating care. So like we talked about, if someone is in cardiac arrest and it's due to just clear trauma, which was actually the case in the earlier terrain photo I showed where someone had gone off the cliff, rescuers can then withhold resuscitation. As no survivor with traumatic cardiac arrest has been reported. And then additionally, the risk of severe neurological damage from cardiac arrest due to asphyxiation is significant. So avalanche victims who are found pulseless or apneic with a core temp greater than 30, they most likely died from asphyxia. And then after 30 minutes, you can also terminate those resuscitation attempts. And then with regards to serum potassium, this is a pretty interesting one. The Wilderness Medical Society, at the time of this guideline publication, 2017, they stated that if someone had a serum potassium greater than 8 millimoles per liter, rescuers could withhold resuscitation. We'll get into this on the next page. I think this is just kind of a cool, interesting one. So serum potassium is a strong predictor of survival. The idea being is that cells are full of potassium, and as cells die, they explode that potassium in the blood. So your blood potassium rises. The highest recorded potassium in an avalanche victim is 6.4 millimoles per liter. So actually in 2019, the avalanche algorithm that we'll get into from the International Commission on Alpine Rescue, they decreased the level to 7 millimoles from 8 millimoles per liter. But the range of 7 to 8 is that kind of line where they say, you know, your resuscitation efforts are likely to be futile. And the question may come up of like, well, how do you measure this in the field? And it's not commonly done in the US, but in Europe, there are helicopter crews who come with doctors in the helicopters, and they'll have point of care labs where they can measure this in the field. And then another reason to terminate resuscitation would be risk to the rescuer, because personal rescuer safety is the #1 priority. So just thinking about additional hazards like additional avalanches, dangerous weather, or rescuer illness like exhaustion, hypothermia, fatigue, or frostbite. So those would be times where you could delay or terminate resuscitation efforts. And just thinking about definitive care, if someone has trauma, they're going to be going to a trauma center. If someone's hypothermic with cardiac instability or arrest, like we talked about, we'd be hoping for an ECLS facility. More minor injuries might go to a community hospital. And if someone was not fully buried and not that injured, they might even be going home, but just thinking about all these possible options. And the WMS does recommend that, like we stated, a hypothermic avalanche victim should be going to an ECLS facility. All right. And lastly, we're going to be moving into an avalanche resuscitation checklist. These are designed to assist in guideline adherence. They're designed to be complete at the site of the accident, and they will remain with the patient until hospital admission because they do provide good information. And I'll be honest, when I first saw one of these things, like this is a very common one here from the International Commission on Alpine Rescue. I mean, it kind of looks like a mess, but let's go through it step by step real quick. It'll make it a little easier. So you put the patient's name, time of the avalanche, and the time to their face exposure. And then their burial time. So how many minutes were they buried? Or you can also alternatively use the core temperature here. Did they have vital signs or not? Then zooming out a little bit, so we have the burial time, the vital signs, and then, like let's say they had burial time less than 60 minutes, no vital signs, so you move to CPR, and you look at the core temp to follow your guidelines there. Or if they're buried more than 60 minutes, did not have vital signs, but did not have, or did have a patent airway, then we're going to be moving to CPR here. So we'll zoom out a little bit more. We're going down this line. So we're starting CPR first, did they have lethal trauma? Let's say they didn't. Did they have a shockable rhythm? Let's say they did. Was their airway patent, yes or no? If no, then you're stopping because we're thinking asphyxiation. But if yes, then we're going down to core temp. Like, are they in cardiac arrest because of hypothermia or not? Let's say they did have hypothermia. Well, still, we're going to consider, like, are there other people that have a higher chance of survival? Should we move to them first and think about this person's potassium? Or if they're the only one, maybe we're just going to focus all of our efforts on them and get them to the ECLS facility. So there's kind of a basic rundown of how you could navigate through this. And you can take it step by step to determine whether someone, whether you should stop because their airway is not patent, or whether you can send them to the ECLS facility because they have a semi-decent chance of survival. And so with regards to an avalanche resuscitation checklist, the WMS recommends that they should be used whenever possible. And moving on to our last topic is non-avalanche snow burial, which can affect skiers, snowboarders, snowshoers, and snowmobilers who fall into tree wells or deep powder snow. And it usually happens that they fall in head first. Self-extrication is actually really difficult in these things. Tree wells, for those of you who don't know, you can look here, you can see how there's like less snow right around the tree because snow has been kind of sheltered from the branches. And the snow is really unconsolidated there. And in deep snowpacks, these things can be, 4 to 5 meters deep. And so these victims who cannot extricate themselves can actually die from asphyxiation. And it's been found that victims who remove their equipment actually just start to sink deeper. One study showed also that struggling causes victims to sink deeper. The best prevention is to recognize and avoid tree wells and to stay within your skill limits. So if you're skiing on a slope that's too hard, maybe you're more likely to fall into one of these. If you have a partner, try to maintain vocal and visual contact. And that, if possible, they speculate, maybe try grabbing tree branches while falling to try and stay upright to avoid going head first, which would increase that snow into your mouth. No evidence does exist, however, to confirm the effectiveness of these measures. And I just think back to there was one at the ski area that I worked at where there was an older man who was buried for 95 minutes. And his friend came, was like, I can't find him. And, we had everyone in the resort searching for him for a long time. And we actually did pull him out. He developed pulmonary edema about 8 hours after, but he did otherwise survive intact. Pretty scary things that happen though. So for the recommendations, Wilderness Medical Society just says to avoid falling into them. That's the only known means for prevention. And that try to keep your skis and snowboards attached so you don't sink deeper. And that there is insufficient evidence to recommend the use of transceivers, airbags, the artificial air pocket devices to prevent any kind of asphyxiation from non-avalanche snow burial. For concluding remarks, the guidelines are described above are they're general evidence-based recommendations for the prevention, rescue, and resuscitation of avalanche accidents. Foundation is based on avalanche avoidance, and the use of good judgment is of primary importance. Data is limited regarding safety techniques and avalanche injury management. As you can imagine, randomized controlled trials and simulations are difficult in some of these things. The numbers just aren't that large as well. And that future research is warranted in the efficacy of helmets, although we can imagine that they are likely very useful, but there's just not a lot of studies that have been done on helmets. Avalanche airbags for the prevention of trauma. Maybe there'll be different transceiver technology that can be on our cell phones in the future. And, just other medical advances. For example, ECLS has been one in the past few decades that has proved to be very helpful. Here's some references. On top is the WMS guidelines. There's also a great article here I want to recommend from Brugger and al. And he was actually part of this committee from the WMS as well on accidental hypothermia. Also want to credit Dr. Tom Delory, who I believe is on this call. He helped me out with some of these old slides from a different talk, and my former ski patrol for the great experiences. Thanks so much for your time and for listening. And it's been great to chat about avalanches.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. That was basically a crash course on an ARI level 1. It mixed in with guidelines from the WMS. But anybody have any questions or comments?
Justin, I've got a brief comment
Yeah.
as well. Thank you, Lindsay. That was excellent. Really enjoyed looking through and reading your perspectives out there. As far as kind of the practical and the maybe lived experience of avalanches in North America and in Europe, we have such great data and such great information. Every single avalanche fatality or injury that happens is recorded, is well documented, has a professional report associated with it, whether it's a fatality or an injury. And I think those can be really helpful to learn about the events leading up to it, kind of the lessons we can learn from it, and everything regarding that. So every state across the Mountain West where there are avalanches has local avalanche centers that work with these and publish these. Inbound avalanches go through the same protocol as well with ski patrols. And these are all publicly available. So if you haven't read an accident report, I find that they're very engaging and can paint a real life picture of the events leading up to it and kind of the aftermath of all that.
Yeah, Jackie, I think that's a great contribution. And actually, your state, the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, does keep that national database as well, too. Super, super good.
All right. Oh, Kylie, I'm going to get you for a second, just kind of bouncing off of what Lindsay and Jaffe just mentioned. I'm going to share my own screen for a second. And I want to show you kind of what they were just talking about. I am very new to this. I just learned this a week, like within a week. But this is the CAIC that they were both talking about. So this is a website run by Colorado Avalanche Information Center. So you can basically, you can see the website at the top here, avalanche.state.co.us. And you can see this map here that shows the different regions throughout Colorado that just really easily clickable. So when I was in Colorado, I was in the Front Range. I was in Rocky Mountain National Park, just outside of Estes Park. So you click on that and it brings you here. I was kind of futzing around with this while during the talk. So it shows you different avalanche risk at different elevations, essentially below, basically at or above tree line. Today looks like a nice day to get out there. And then you get down to this kind of rose pattern here for the persistent slab type avalanche that she talked about. So you can see on the northwest, north, northeast, east faces of the mountains are the highest risk today. It's possible, and they're small to large size avalanches. You can scroll down a little bit further. You can see pictures of the avalanche types that they were talking about. And then you go down a little bit further and you can see a weather forecast at about 11,000 feet. And you can go through and see forecasts from different years, different dates. And then if you click on observation weather stations, you get all these different weather stations that show you the temperature, the dew point, speed of wind, direction of wind, how fast the gusts are. So you can plan your trip based on the past week, month, the entire year, or historic. And then you go into what Jaffe was kind of mentioning, the accident report. So I clicked here for Colorado. You can do US and statistics and reporting. So here's the avalanches that have unfortunately it's been a pretty rough year for avalanche deaths. This year has been pretty bad in Colorado and Utah so far this year. So this is a cool website. I'm still new to it, learning as I go, but it's fun to play around with. So any questions based on that, or any comments, additions to just using cool resources like that? Do other states have similar websites? Probably. I know this one.
They do, yeah. Other states have excellent websites as well. I'd highly recommend the Utah Avalanche Center. They do an excellent job as well, very user-friendly, and they're probably among the better funded ones. I'll put it in the chat box out here, Utah Avalanche Center.
Awesome. Kylie, whenever you are ready, go ahead and take us through this article. It's kind of fun to think about because I know the guidelines, they mentioned airbags versus beacons, and it's kind of cool to see some data about it.
Yeah, sounds good. And thank you so much, Lindsay. That was an awesome presentation. Let me pull up share screen here. Okay, and let's play this. Is everyone able to see the screen? You good? Okay, great. So the paper that, as was mentioned, is basically looking at 2 avalanche rescue devices on survival. And this paper is by Herman Bruckberger and al. In 2007. And just a little bit about me. I'm also a 3rd-year med student actually at University of Colorado. And before med school, did a little bit with wilderness medicine, taught some woofer classes, took my ARI in undergrad, and then grew up in Colorado. So I've always been pretty interested in avalanches. So just to start, what is the annual impact of avalanches and how many deaths do they cause per year? Using that CAIC website that we were just looking at, this is one of the stats, the graphs that actually have showed from the 1950s, kind of the fatalities of avalanche each year. And we actually saw a pretty big increase in the late 1990s to the early 2000s. And the paper itself kind of cited that there's annually about 140 avalanches every year. Most of those are in Europe, but the United States usually sees about 27, 30. And as you just mentioned too, this year has been a bit worse in terms of avalanche deaths, especially here in Colorado. which is very unfortunate to see. But there definitely are, it's a pretty high mortality rate worldwide, about 140. So definitely something we want to avoid. And then this is an avalanche in Colorado this year, no fear, that took 3 lives, unfortunately. Let's see. So, and Lindsay kind of brought us through these too, but what we know how to survive an avalanche. So the first kind of thing that we'd look at is the grade of burial. And what that refers to is complete versus partial burial. So those terms, complete basically means the snow is covering the patient's head and chest, versus partial is when one of those are exposed. And so in a complete burial, you have a 52, basically 50-50 chance of mortality, versus a partial burial, it's much lower, it's 4%. So that's one of the things at first is the grade. And then the next is the duration of burial. And I think Lindsay also mentioned the stat, but basically around 15 minutes, you have about 90% chance of survival, but that drastically decreases by 35 minutes, you have 34% chance of survival. So duration of burial is a big one. And then again, the presence of the air pocket and having a clear airway. And finally, the severity of mechanical injury. And some studies have shown, one recently, I think it was 2009, that asphyxiation is 75% of the causes of death, while trauma is only 25%. And so with that being said, what we want to do is try to come up with devices that will promote these things that will promote survival. So the first one is reducing the depth, and that is done with airbags. And then the second is reduce the duration, and that's done with the transceiver. And then finally, prolonging the survival after complete burial. And that we mentioned is like the Avalanche is one where you can have basically just this increased oxygenation and being able to create that air pocket. However, for this, it just looked at those 2 devices, the transceiver and the airbag. And so we'll get into then what is the question of this study was, do these avalanche rescue devices have an effect on mortality? So the first one being the transceiver, there'd been evidence in the past that transceivers definitely reduce time to extrication. And then one study actually didn't show a significant change in mortality. However, one more recent in 2005 showed that there was a decrease in mortality with the use of transceivers. So this study wanted to, again, look more into the actual reduction in mortality. And we briefly went through how transceivers work, but basically the buried patient has theirs on send, and it kind of sends out these waves in this butterfly pattern. And then as you see here, it will take the rescuer kind of in this like semicircular search pattern. And there's so many different transceivers now on the market, but all using that same mechanism. And then airbags, it's always fun to watch avalanche videos, I feel like, in avalanche talks, but as Lindsay was saying, they basically make you bigger. They make your particle bigger than what the snow will engulf. And so the idea is that you'll float on top of the snow rather than being sucked underneath. And you can see him here, staying above the slide rather than being sucked underneath. And I've never used an airbag, and I actually don't know anyone who has, so I'd love some input on if anyone uses one or their thoughts on it. But we can get to that at the end. So that's just a little bit of background. So then, let's see. So then what were the methods for this study? So they looked at a retrospective analysis of all the cases in Switzerland and Austria during the seasons of the 90s to the early 2000s. And then interesting, in Switzerland, they transceivers, the way they record a lot of these accidents, there's definitely great records, but sometimes in terms of the transceivers used, they'll only say if it was used if they were successful in unburying the patient, and not necessarily if like there was a burial and they didn't use a transceiver. So there's a lot of recording errors. But anyways, they looked at Switzerland and Austria. And then one of the other things they really had to account for was just cofactors for mortality. So of course you would think that if there's a bigger avalanche, bigger width length, there's more like higher chance of mortality, not depending on which device is used. So they tried to control for width and length. They controlled for the grade of the burial. So was it partial? Was it complete? They even looked at like type of group. So was it with one person, two people? Was there a guide? And then finally the activity compared was either like off-piste skiing versus backcountry touring. And so then after doing some exclusion criteria, they initially saw that there are about 2,000 cases, but had to take about 800 of those out because they didn't have data on width or length of the avalanche. And then so total, they looked at cases for airbag was around 1,500. And then for transceiver, they also excluded some of the exclusion criteria involved if they were the person self-extricated, as well as if there's either like audio or visual sign of the burial. So all of those cases were excluded. So we got down to 317 for the transceiver. And then looking at the results, looking at tables like this always just drives me crazy because you're like, there's a million numbers on this. So we can just, for now, focus on what kind of the exact devices. It is interesting to go through and look at the other factors, but to not overwhelm with all the numbers, what we'll look at here is these two factors is what they use to come up with that number that's kind of well known of saying, okay, airbags reduce mortality by 91%. And so this is what they did. They looked at the mortality or those that did not survive the avalanche in those that used an airbag and that used those that did not. And what they found was what we call an odds ratio of 0.09, which then correlates to that relative reduction of the 91%. And so basically they showed that almost 300 people died, but the one person, and then there's only one with an airbag that died. So they correlated that to saying, okay, well, the reduction in mortality is 91%. And if you look at the confidence intervals, it is statistic, but the confidence interval is from 25 to 99%, so super wide range. And then with the avalanche transceiver or the beacon, you look at these two numbers, and this is how they calculated the mortality reduction of 74%. Same kind of idea. They said, okay, those that didn't use it, there was a 70% chance that they did not survive, or there's 70% that did not, versus 55% who did, in those that went to an odds ratio of 0.26. So that's kind of how they went through the data and got those numbers. And again, this has a really wide range, so the numbers definitely are not perfect, but it is some kind of data on devices. And then there was another study about 5 years later in 2014 that tried to kind of take this idea and say, okay, what really is going on with the airbags? Is it like, are these crucial avalanche burials in the sense that like this would have been, they would have died without the airbag? And they found actually that the adjusted risk ratio was 0.51. And so this being said, and Lindsay also cited this study saying that like it went from 20% to 10%. So there's like this 11% change, and that correlated to a 50% reduction in mortality. So it went from 91% when they kind of looked through this data, and then 4 years later, what they really think more is a 50% change in mortality, which is still significant, and definitely still worth using an airbag. And then the other thing that they found in this study as well is that 7 of the 35 people who used an airbag didn't inflate, which is correlating to 20%. And in the 2014 study, they also found that 20% did not inflate, mostly due to the like user error, as was mentioned. So just something, again, like 1 in 5 airbags will not inflate. And so what were some of the kind of like limitations, and what was the validity of this study? And so I think first, when reviewing any study, you look at the internal validity and look at kind of the confounding variables. And I think they actually did a fairly good job of trying to control for all these. I mean, they really tried to control for like the severity or size of the avalanche, as well as other things, including like the group, the type of activity. So they did pretty well at controlling all the confounding variables as well as they could. And with that, like the avalanche severity, it's hard to it's hard to say like, okay, would have this device worked if it was a different severity of avalanche? And then the next one that kind of to internal validity, as I mentioned, between like Switzerland and Austria even, and then when you look at when you look at the United States, a lot of the data is not specific about what devices were used. So there's some that have airbag use, there's some that have transceiver use, but it's definitely not across the board that each report will have this. So that was a huge limitation, and they tried to like look at several different data sets to avoid this. But again, definitely something that they couldn't completely avoid. And then the case numbers, of course, are low, especially there's 35 airbag users. And then the transceiver numbers were also pretty low. Fortunate for us because there haven't been that many avalanche deaths, but just a problem in wilderness medicine kind of throughout the research is that our case numbers just are not super extreme. And so then looking at external validity for this study, as mentioned, it was just Austria and Switzerland. So, and a lot of those avalanches are different than what we see in Colorado or see in Oregon or see in the United States. So just in terms of the external validity, not totally applicable. I think it's still definitely still informative, but when you want to know, okay, is it the same in like Colorado avalanches? Maybe not. And then in terms of like device types, now airbags, I feel like I'll have all different types of designs and shapes. And so knowing whether that kind of applies across the board is something kind of interesting to think in terms of the external validity. And then in this specific study, they only looked at skiers. They didn't really include like snowmobilers, anything like that. So it was just specific for the activity. And then the final kind of box to this and limitation, I think, with a lot of wilderness med and avalanche studies is that human element. And I think especially in transceivers and beacons, so much of the successes comes down to training. And that's something I think is like impossible almost to control for. I mean, you can definitely say like, did they get Area 1? Have they been, practicing those skills? But I think that's a big component of this as well as kind of that knowledge piece. And so here's another just fun video of avalanches as we talk about the take-home points. Maybe. And he did not get stuck in this one, but it is pretty significant just to watch. Okay, so let's see. Stop that. So the first take-home point, of course, is that there is a reduction in mortality for specifically ski tours and off-piste skiers with airbags and transceivers. And do we know the exact numbers and percentages? Probably not, but there's definitely mortality benefit, which I think is the most important point taking away. And it's nice to have that evidence, kind of evidence-based, as we say, evidence-based medicine all the time, but especially when I think teaching in different classes and recommending these devices, it is shown that it does help mortality. And then I think it's also important to recognize though that even like the airbags, there are pretty significant failure rates specifically in this study and in some of the follow-up studies, just to keep in mind, and that can be due to training, user error, things like that. And then finally, one other thing I thought was interesting is just the importance of documenting. And I love that we brought up the kind of the reports on the CAIC, and even in Europe has some great reports. But one of the things that I didn't see, especially in the CAIC, was this person, did they have transceivers? Did they use their transceiver? Did they have airbags? Did they have other devices? I think that might just be an interesting component in the future, especially if we wanted to continue this kind of research and effectiveness of these different rescue devices, is kind of encouraging in creating almost like a more of a robust data set. The fact that it even is out there and that we can all see that is already a huge plus, but I think in the future and just kind of thinking through the research side of things, it would be really interesting if more was documented. And then, oops, let's see. And so kind of then with this research, which is, I think, really interesting just to try to find the evidence, where do we go from here? Like this was almost, what, 15 years ago that this was published. And there's been some research since, but I think there's other devices like the Avalanche, and there has been some more research on the success of that. And even what other future devices are kind of down the pipeline. I think looking at the, ways of survival and then being like, okay, how do we promote these different things? I think it'll be interesting to kind of see where the Avalanche realm goes, especially as more people are getting out into the backcountry. Is it going to stay at the beacon shovel probe level, or will more and more people have airbags or other devices in the future? And then, of course, I think the education and human component is always worth talking about. Doing an area class or the know before you go will obviously help with reduction in mortality, or will hopefully help. And I think another important point, and was mentioned in a couple of the articles at the end, is that kind of this risk compensation. So those that go out with an airbag, do they say, okay, well, I have this safety device, now I'm going to push it a little bit harder today, and will that, kind of just counteract the safety measures of having the airbag? I think is something interesting to think about in terms of just our levels of risk tolerance and these kind of like safety devices. Is it truly helpful, or is it something that we rely almost too much on versus, our knowledge of slope angles and the basics of knowing avalanche danger? So that was just kind of an interesting point in terms of these safety devices. And then otherwise, that is all I have. I'm happy to open up for some questions or input on if anyone's used airbags in the past. And then this is the first, the article, and these are some of the follow-up articles as well.
Any questions for Lindsay? Oh, sorry, not Lindsay or Kylie. All right. Well, I know we lost a little chunk of time there due to unforeseen circumstances. So I was going to ask if anybody read the other articles I had put on the Google Drive folder, but I don't think it's worth kind of going into depth on all of them. I'll just kind of like breeze through a couple points that I thought were kind of cool. So in the article I put on there called Body Position of Buried Avalanche Victims, I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, with a lot of these studies, they're retrospective, going off of data from these avalanche centers from different countries, different continents, different companies. So the data they've gathered is not standardized. But in the patients or victims, I suppose, that they documented body positioning, it was only 253 out of 1,085 victims that they actually had access to. So a fourth that actually had this information recorded. 45% were found buried prone, so face down. 24% found supine or face up. So the last one was 16% like in a sitting or standing position, 15% on their side. So thinking when you're digging, you're probably going to find them overall in some position other than face down, because 45% of the time they're face down. That means 55% of the time they're in another position. But your hope is that they're not going to be face down. It's going to be tough to provide any interventions or even assess them completely if they're face down. And then in those same 1,085 patients that were in their study, 135 of them had mention of head and body positions, and 45% of those patients were prone and head downhill. So overwhelmingly, you're going to find them in a different position, but hopefully it just kind of gives you a better idea that in the large majority of patients, they're going to be head downhill. So hopefully you at least get to the head first. Just kind of fun to think about. Doesn't mean much in the end, but just kind of remember that. And then there was a case study that I mentioned. It was in, I'm trying to remember where they were in their study here. Anyway, it was a patient that he was backcountry skiing. There was an avalanche noted by a ranger looking at a camera, and he saw an avalanche, remembering that he had seen somebody ski down that similar path earlier. He went out just to check, found them. I got my timeline here. 2 hours after he found snow footprints in the snow. So the patient's been 2 hours since the avalanche happened. On scene, it took him 13 minutes to dig down deep enough to unbury the patient's head. So the patient was buried for 2 hours and 18 minutes. I can go further into it, but basically, this patient was somehow had a good enough air pocket. He had a clear airway, no trauma. He was just buried in very lightweight clothes. It was a warmer day, and he, on the picture, if you see, he's just got like a very, very, very light jacket. He's confused when he gets out, but they see no signs of trauma. They try and convince him to lay flat, and he refuses. He like climbs up, kind of stands up quickly, and he goes into cardiac arrest within 2 minutes. Any ideas on why that would have happened? Okay, so this is one of the rare cases when hypothermia actually is a large factor. There's another study that shows like rate of cooling in totally completely buried patients. It's like 0.3 degrees Celsius per hour decrease in a range from 0.3 to 9 Celsius decrease in body temp per hour of burial. The average seems to be about 1.3 Celsius per hour decrease in core body temp per hour. So basically this guy's buried for 2 hours, 18 minutes. He was probably at least in moderate hypothermia because he was confused. He stood up and most likely had a combination of rescue collapse and core afterdrop and movement, and he was in ventricular fibrillation. He ended up dying 2 hours later. So just an interesting case to kind of put everything together to see that sometimes they can survive a prolonged burial, at least to unburial. Otherwise, if anybody has any other questions, comments, I do have a case we could work through. We are kind of near the end though. Jaffe, do you have any comments you'd like to make or tips for us for further training or ways to be safer out in the backcountry?
Thanks, Justin. Honestly, I think just practical experience in the mountains. There's so much to be said about understanding snow, how it works, observing avalanches, and just looking at terrain. And mileage goes a long ways. And thankfully, humans, as far as our understanding of avalanches itself goes, is pretty advanced. You know, of course, there's a lot of mysteries in the natural world, but we know how snow works well enough to be able to manage it really well at places like ski resorts, to have highway corridors open, to have mountain communities living and surviving for a long period of time over sustained winters. And so I think overall, the great mysteries for me really lie in human psychology and decision making, traps and heuristics and failures of our own minds, not so much of maybe our understanding of snow. It is a natural phenomena, so it's scientific, it's observable, it's predictable. And so that for me is an empowering thing, is that at the end of the day, you know, where we can really focus our efforts is just education, practice, and good judgment. And that's, you know, a lifetime enterprise that thankfully it's fun to be out in the mountains. So most of us do it with that level of enthusiasm.
Makes sense. I've only done in-resort, inbound skiing and snowboarding forever. And hopefully this next year, I'm going to do some backcountry training and continue my avalanche training myself and then get out there in the backcountry personally. Again, like I said, we're at 15 minutes till the scheduled end. Anybody that feels like they need to get going, that is perfectly understandable. For anybody that wants to stay, I do have a case that I wanted to work through. I went to one of the WMS conferences, I think it's like 2 years ago now, in Park City. And this is kind of somewhat taken from them. So I haven't updated it with what I've learned since. So hopefully with all we've learned tonight, we can work through and have some fun. It's going to be a very, hopefully, interactive session. So please join in. I don't like to hear myself talk more than I have to. I'm going to share my screen so we can pull up the PowerPoint. So like I said, this is a very old PowerPoint. I have not updated it with new data that I found. I'm going to scroll through here. One thing that I thought was cool, we haven't mentioned this yet, before I get to the case. This is a duration of burial on the X, probability of survival on the Y axis here. It's a Canadian and Swiss study. It's basically showing survival compared to time. So when you get to about 15 minutes here, your survivability just plummets. So that's why our goal is, typically what I've read is 15 minutes, but I think what we're looking for now is 10 minutes as a goal of digging the victim out. And then you can see it never really touches zero because there is always that chance that they have a good air pocket. And then this is the chance that hypothermia might kick in. And for further pictures, what an Avalanche, this is an Avalanche. We haven't talked about it yet, but it's essentially a valve that separates your inhaled air and your exhaled air. So when you inhale, it brings in air from in front of you. You exhale, it kind of exports the air behind you. And the hope is it prolongs your ability to avoid asphyxia, because it's going to avoid your rebreathing essentially. I don't think they make them anymore. I think most people just have them as almost like saying, hey, I still have this really cool thing that used to make. And this is another picture of an airbag. The thought is it helps you reduce your burial, essentially, like she said. And my case is here. So again, hopefully you guys can see this, and it'd be awesome if you could kind of join in. So the scenario is, let's say you're in a national forest. It's a mixed use area. There's snowmobilers, backcountry skiers, snowshoers, things like that. It's snowmobilers at about 15,000 feet that actually trigger the avalanche. As a total understanding of who's involved, there's 7 people who self-rescued or partial burial. One person was a complete burial, but was unburied by one of his companions, which is essentially the goal, is having a companion rescue. 2 people are unknown. You suspect that they're completely buried because you don't see them. So think of yourself as rangers at the National Forest, and you and your partner get to scene 18 minutes after avalanche occurs. So thinking back to that survivability curve, we're already getting to scene at 18 minutes. To further complicate the issue, it's 90 minutes until sunset. And sometime in the night, there is expected to be a pretty severe storm that's going to make it unsafe to be on the mountain. There is shelter, food, water in a nearby mountain hut. It's about 20 minutes by walking from the scene of the avalanche. And let's say from like the scene of the, like midway down the avalanche. So it's not like way away, 20-minute walk. You and your partner came up with a snowmobile with a litter. You have the capability of transporting 2 people tonight. So you can take 2 people down for extrication tonight. The snowmobile that was in the avalanche is not usable. Your medical command, your search and rescue command says no further help is available. You're only allowed to basically take 1 trip. You can bring 2 people down with you. That's it. So keeping all that in mind, here's like a list of the people that were involved in the avalanche. You have a 48-year-old female. She was the passenger on the snowmobile. She's alert, ambulatory. She has a wrist deformity. Anybody paying attention, what would you categorize her as, like a triage severity score? From green, yellow, red, black.
It'd be green.
Yep.
Wounded.
Yep, walking wounded. B, you have the driver of the snowmobile, was not wearing a helmet, is partially buried, has a massive head injury, open depressed skull fracture, unresponsive, breathing spontaneously, radial pulse in the 50s. What would you classify them?
Dark red.
Yeah, sure. So keep that in mind, though. Remember, you're on the edge of a mountain. It's essentially a mass casualty situation. They are red. So yeah, they will require immediate attention, but let's keep going through. So third, 29-year-old skier, partial burial, agitated, poorly responsive. They have good radial pulses, but a right thigh deformity with diminished distal pulses in that leg.
Also red.
Yep. So I would go through and explain why, but we're short on time. Next patient, 27-year-old skier. They struck their chest against a tree during the avalanche. They are ambulatory. They have a chest pain, mild cough, mild hemoptysis. What would you classify them?
Yellow.
Yellow.
Yep. 32-year-old skier was partially buried, extricated by companion. Actually, let's say, I'm sorry, completely buried, extricated by companions found to have an ice mask, which means snow and ice was occluding the airway. They're unresponsive, no pulse, completely apneic. One of the bystanders, so basically one of the other victims, is doing CPR. What would you classify them?
Black.
I didn't know we had anybody intact enough to do CPR.
There's a couple more at the bottom that are okay.
Okay.
So what would you
One-handed with
classify?
the
I
wrist.
think I heard a black, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can get back to them in a second. Just trying to go through what we got. So this is essentially me, except I'm not 42, from the Midwest, first run of the trip. Let's say they just flew in from like central Indiana last night, and they made the wonderful decision to go straight to the resort and then go off resort and go skiing. They're ambulatory, complaining of shortness of breath. She is helping, so she was helping to dig out that one buried person. She's now tachypnic to 36. She's got some wheezing. What would you classify her?
Green.
Technically yellow, I would say.
Yeah, by respiratory rate, she is yellow. But yes, she is walking. She's ambulatory. She's not confused. But with this respiratory rate, she technically is yellow. What would you be worried about for her?
Ape.
Yep. So you have a 18-year-old skier in partial burial, unable to move their legs or feel below, let's say, waist, but good pulses in their legs. What would you rate this person? It's kind of tricky.
Potential for long-term
That's the-
deficits. So kind
that's
of want
the-
to go red. I mean, I don't think they're going to die, but at the same time, that's bad.
Right, that's the tricky thing. So long-term is not what we're thinking about right now. It sounds bad, but we're thinking acute, it's triage. So she's like, let's call her she, whatever. Let's make her like a yellow. She can't walk, but she's not going to die, at least right now. So she's like a yellow. And then H and I, these are the patients you don't know where they are. You have a 7-year-old. It was the child of the patients that were C and D, and we can remind ourselves who those were. Was wearing a helmet, but did not have any RECO or RICO equipped clothing, does not have a beacon. 23-year-old male, was wearing an airbag, does have a beacon. So remembering all those if you can, I know there's a lot. So we already went through the triage priorities. We have the 2 missing people. I can't, sorry, I didn't email these out to you, but who do you think we can have help? We basically have this person, F. They can probably you can probably give them a beacon and have them walk around a little bit.
Oh, who had the messed up wrist? They got
Yes.
one good wrist.
Yeah, give them a beacon. They can definitely help. Chest pain and hemoptysis, she could potentially help. This thigh deformity, no. This person, no. You've basically got like 2 or 3 people plus yourself that can help. What interventions do you want to do right now? with the patients that you've got. So we've got this, let's say like this person, they've got essentially a spinal cord injury. Do you want to do anything with them right now?
Stabilize the spine.
Yeah, you could do that. Unfortunately, like when you're doing mass casualty triage, like just kind of let them sit there. You've got, it's unfortunate, but you've got more priorities than potential long-term. And let's just assume like they're unable to move their legs. Like, sorry, not right now. Somebody will try and fix that later. This person, I'd have them help. They've probably got hate, but hopefully they can help a little bit. This person that we categorize as black, what do you want to do?
Stash them in the snow. We'll deal with them later.
Yeah, black is unfortunately, you're going to tag them as black and move on. No further interventions. Chest pain and hemoptysis, we've already said we can try and have her help. Right thigh deformity, diminished pulse. What do you think we should do with this one?
This guy, you should at least try to reduce to see if you could maybe help him.
Mm-hmm. Because this person, this is like loss of life, loss of limb. This person with a massive head injury, what do you want to do with them?
He needs to go.
Yeah. So that's the patients that we have in front of us. Now let's go back to the two buried ones, because the next question is, we've already kind of focused on who can help. So how long do you want to search? Like I said, we got 90 minutes from arrival until dark, and we have to get people out before dark, basically. The two people we can transport before dark. So we got two people that we can't see right now. We've got, let's say, 4 people or 5 people can help search. One person's buried, has an airbag and a beacon. So if we have beacons, we can hopefully find him. And then unfortunately, we got the 7-year-old that you can't see, no correct clothing for Rico, no beacon. How long do you think you'd want to search up there? It's a vague question. I don't know if there is a right answer. Just kind of open-ended.
Were C and D conscious or able to answer? I lost track.
Hold on. I was just seeing some people in the comments are saying the answers. C and D. D is mom.
I'm just curious if somebody, if we're miscounting and someone thanks the kid, or is this like we've definitely lost a kid here somewhere?
Yeah, kid's definitely gone or missing. So mom is the one with a little bit of minor trauma from hitting the tree. C is dad, and he's the one with the thigh deformity.
Okay.
So that does that brings some social issues into play, doesn't it? You got 2 other people on the mountain who are the parents of a kid that you're potentially not going to find.
Yeah.
One who needs to get down the mountain quick. Anyway, so this 7-year-old, you could potentially form like a line of people like with poles in a pole line. It's probably not going to happen. You have no way to find this person essentially besides your poles. Then this 23-year-old, they have a transponder, so you could essentially set up a beacon search pattern to find this person. It's already been 18 minutes. You don't have much time. You got to be super quick because the digging is time consuming and super exhausting. So just this is again very open-ended, just for thinking. Essentially, you have a decent chance finding this person, the 23-year-old. Actually digging them out in time, not sure. It's already been 18 minutes till you first got there, dealt with the scene, talked to people. The 7-year-old, it's unfortunate, but you might not find this kid. So which 2 patients do you want to get down?
Head injury and thigh.
Yeah, you got basically this person who has to go right now in the thigh, so they don't lose their leg in life, essentially. The person we listed as black is dead. Let's say we unburied the 23-year-old patient and they just had some very minor traumatic injuries. They're okay. So then we've got to some people that are going to walk and get snowmobiled over to that hut, and they're going to unfortunately have to spend the night in a hut knowing what just happened. And you're going to have the mom probably in the hut and the dad down at some hospital and probably not have a kid found. So this is, like I said,
Paralyzed guy.
sorry.
Our half paralyzed guy is also going to the hut.
Yep. He's spinal cord injury. There's nothing really that's going to change tonight versus tomorrow. You can give him Decadron, I suppose, to reduce swelling, but it's unfortunately not as emergent as the other two. Again, just kind of a morbid thought process here to keep your minds open to how important companion rescue is. Basically, like, it's great we talk about all these rescue plans and teams and groups, but if you can't get to these people within like 15 minutes or companion, you can't rescue them, it's not going to be a great outcome in the large majority. So that's why it's so important to take these courses and to know what you're doing, avoid avalanches, and have the right rescue gear, and travel with people that have good training themselves and people you trust, basically. Any questions about the case? Like I said, I didn't make it, I kind of stole it, basically. All right, anybody have any comments, concerns, questions about avalanches in general? I went into this ARI course basically thinking the West had good snow and the East had bad snow. And apparently there's more to it than that.
I was going to say, does the East have, yes, we do have a mountain or two probably big enough to actually maybe have an avalanche. I just can't think of them.
I don't think there's much around here in Virginia. One
New
of the
England
studies
has
that,
some avalanche terrain, New Hampshire, Mount Washington area, so forth.
yeah,
Nice.
out in Vermont, New Hampshire area. I'm gonna click that case. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and especially thank you to everyone who joined back. Obviously, everybody who joined back. I'm glad you guys were keeping your phones and computers nearby to get my email updates. But so this recording, I'll post that, or Gabby and I will post this to the Wilderness Medical Society YouTube page, and I'll send that link out soon. I advise everybody taking these cool courses, WFO, WFR, AWLS, ARI, level 1, just good ways to know how to take care of people when you're outside of medical clinics and you don't have all the resources that you're used to at work. That's the whole point of this, basically. So thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to stop recording.